I'm going to get straight into it because what I'm presenting today is a condensed version of a 3 or 4 hour workshop that we ran in Townsville a couple of weekends ago, and so I'm cramming it in and just spraying it at you. So let's go. All right, so my name's Grace Loyden. I'm the head of faculty at Townsville Grammar School. I was previously at Mount Isa for 10 years. Absolutely loved it. So I come to you today from an appreciation of a variety of schooling contexts and recognise that we're all champions doing our very best, and I thank you for your efforts and I also thank you for your time today as well. I haven't provided in the pack a printout of the slides from today's presentation, so if you would like me to send you the slides, I encourage you to write down my email address and I will gladly forward them to you. I just had very restricted weight requirements on the plane today. Do I bring hairspray or do I bring PowerPoint slides? I have a lot of hair. But I went with one pair of shoes just so I could make sure everyone got one booklet, so thank me for that. Okay. So I'll feel like I'll have done my job if by the end of the session we've got some greater understanding of the nuances of IA1 that's coming up in our syllabus that we'll be starting to teach next year. I'd like us to have a think about some of the different purposes and contexts that we might be asking students to write for, and I'd like us to be able to sort of rattle off a list of genre patterns and conventions that we want to focus on in our teaching. And I'm thinking that perhaps the last dot point might be the one that's the most useful, so I'll try and get to the first three in the first half and then look at the last dot point for the second half of the session. If you have any questions, please just ask, because they're usually more helpful when you ask in the moment rather than later on, I find. Okay, so in your booklet, you've got, please make sure you've got one. I've got a couple left over, and if there's anyone that's missed out, I'll give you this one. I was just using it, but so it's a bit creased. I don't know if you like creases. Everyone's their own crease issues. So in your pack, I've tried to find real-life examples of the text types in which students can use in their response to IA1. So you've got an article, an essay, a column and a blog in there. The first couple of pages are the relevant extracts from the syllabus relating to this task. And each textual example, it's perfectly fine. Each textual example actually deals with a text on the prescribed text list. So I thought that they might be helpful resources for you generally. The first one is a magazine article about Mabo, the film Mabo, which is on the list. And then we've got an essay on Stan Grant's Talking to My Country. The essay is quite scathing of the text, which I thought was an interesting read. It's a little long for what we get students to write, but it's an interesting approach to the essay. The column from the monthly on Blade Runner is actually the new Blade Runner, and it's the first Blade Runner that's on the prescribed text list, but I thought offering this text to you gave you perhaps an opportunity to look at IA1 where they have to deal with two texts, so you could maybe do the first Blade Runner and the second one because only one of the texts needs to come from the prescribed text list. And then number 5 on there is probably the proverbial pot of gold under the rainbow because it's actually a real example of the assignment task. It's a text and blog that deals with two texts on the prescribed text list, Wide Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre. I'd love it if our students were writing at this level about these two texts, but I offer it to you as a good place to start in our consideration of genre patterns and conventions. So we won't spend too much time actually looking through these today, but I've given them to you because at our workshop in Townsville we did quite carefully look at these. We broke into groups and each group considered a different genre, and we tried to brainstorm what the genre patterns and conventions of each one are. And so in a moment I'll give those to you. So you don't actually have the opportunity of the collaboration today, but you get the benefits of the findings at least. So that's why you have that for context. Interestingly, we had some discussion in Townsville about the difference between an article and a column. We've come to the conclusion, we think, that a column is an ongoing spot in a publication for an article. So it's a regularly appearing item in the contents page. It may or may not be by the same writer, but that's what we think we've come to that's what we think it is for now. And obviously the blog is a really interesting inclusion in the syllabus, recognising that there are many different ways of publishing now and many different approaches to editorial processes, and so the blog is a really kind of interesting space to look at, I think. It's possibly where we'll go at my school with the blog, but we'll see how we go. So basically this task in the syllabus focuses on the analysis, interpretation and examination of concepts in texts. Now you're all probably doing a feature article of some description in your current programs. You've all probably engaged with the state panel reports over the last couple of years that sort of have highlighted the complexities associated with the feature article task and whether it's a creating or an evaluating task. In this syllabus, it's an analysing task, but they get marked on their genre patterns and conventions, and we'll discover soon that the genre patterns and conventions of these texts are highly stylised. So we've got a highly stylised approach to analysis, which is really hard. Straight off the cricket bat, it's the first one up. They've got to do it in relation to 2 different texts. It's quite a long assignment, 1,000 to 1,500 words. So it's a doozy. I was on the syllabus writing team, and when we were conceptualising this task, we realised straight away that this was really hard, and so it could not be the external exam. So it had to be the first one, and in the draft Senior English Australian curriculum documentation, it talks about the cognition of comparing. So in the syllabus language, it doesn't use the word compare anywhere. It's not in our objectives. But I feel, and this is just the world according to Loyden, that that skill is implied when you're looking at the connection between 2 texts. You've kind of got to have that skill of comparing, but it's not explicitly stated anywhere in the syllabus. And as I said earlier, one of the studied texts must come from the prescribed text list. They both could, if you wanted to. One could even come from the external exam list. So Jane Eyre, for example, is on the external exam list, but it's got a really nice pairing with obviously White Saga SOC, and hence the inclusion in that booklet for you. Any questions? Okay. So in this assignment, students need to offer a considered perspective. I'd really like to see more considered perspectives in my classroom. I'm not sure about how you guys go in your rooms, but they're not very considered some of the time in my room. And they need to position the reader to think about the text in a particular way. So there's an element of interpretation there. You know, students are prompting the audience to consider the texts in a particular way, and it might be a new way, it might be a controversial way, it might be, however approach they're taking to it, it's their way. And while the primary purpose is to analyse, we know that these sorts of texts have elements of creative, reflective and persuasive writing. So this is the tricky bit, I think. And I'll talk to you later in the session about how we're trying to ready our students for this style of writing. We're not quite there yet, but I think you'll kind of see where we're going with it. And then students can write an article, essay, blog or column, and it can be for an online or a print publication. Look, choose whatever publication you feel is right for your school. At our school, there is going to be no student will write for the Courier Mail, no student will write for the Australian. Each to their own, but we don't feel that the style of texts in those publications allow for a deep analysis of literary texts, and nor does the readership, we think. Maybe, yeah. So that's our kind of approach. And so I offer this website to you called The Conversation. You may or may not have already heard of it. It's a an Australian website actually, and it's where academics publish intellectual articles for the everyday public. And there's coincidentally a really nice article on there called "Here's Why Academics Should Write for the Public." And what's really nice about this text, its website, is that there's deep analysis, examples of deep analysis on here. And so I quite like it. I haven't included this article in your booklet, so if you were to Google that headline, then you would be able to find that really easily. And I've just got a couple of passages that stood out to me from reading that article, and that was that academic writing can be really unpleasant and impossible to read. And I'm not sure about, I know we're all English teachers and we all studied literature at uni, but academic writing about literature is really hard to read. In my grade 10 extension class at the moment, we're reading the play The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, and I'm trying to find examples of academic writing about the text that you don't need a PhD to understand, and it's really, really tricky. So I think that really captures one of the key considerations for this task, is writing academically in an engaging and accessible way. So according to these researchers, the first step in improving academic writing is to learn to reduce the jargon academics use and express concepts clearly. So you know when you're reading, you might be on panel or you might be reading cross-marking or something, and you'll see like the word discourse repeated 7 times in one text, or you'll see all those words just dropped in there without that full development of what that actually means. I think the time is sort of done with that now, and we're writing for people to enjoy these texts, to learn new things about the world, and to appreciate the writer's meaning. And I like this last passage, the passage that the article concludes with. Many academics, including us, now realise that if we want to reach people who might benefit from our research, we have to step out of the ivory tower. We academics need to enter the discussion that the rest of the world engages in every day.
Is it convention?
Yes, it is. Have a seat.
I got told to go back and find it where it was.
Well, I'm pleased you're here. Welcome. So we're looking at here, I think, we're making the study of literary texts cool, in my opinion. We're making it really enjoyable and interesting for people who are motivated to read the text, that read these sorts of articles and essays and things online or in papers or wherever the publication that you've chosen. So there were the 3 points that I got from that article, but you're more than welcome to it's not a difficult article to read. So let's talk about the genre patterns and conventions that we observed in about a 45-minute time period in Townsville a couple of weekends ago. Originally, I gave groups different colours, and each colour meant that they were looking at the article, the column or the blog or the essay. I can't remember which colour was which, and interestingly it doesn't matter because we found that the conventions across the 4 text types are quite similar. So that was a nice learning in itself. This page I think is really this is what we know. This is what we're already doing in our classrooms when we're looking at, when we were asking students to write feature articles or some such thing. That's nothing new to us. But these were some other things that we realised about the texts that are in this booklet at least. Varied sentence lengths. That's nice, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice to get a sample of student writing that had a variety of sentence lengths? We found a real life text that had a paragraph starting with a conjunction. Okay, this one's tricky to read, but there's intertextuality. The scope needs to be established, a broad scope within the beginning of the article. Critique of the text's successes and limitations, images with captions, pull out quotes, title of article and subtitles. And this is an interesting one, endnotes and a bibliography. I don't know how I feel about bibliographies in English. It was something very controversial. We had a lot of history teachers there as well. I don't know where you capture that in the objectives. It's something I hadn't thought about before, but certainly these articles tend to have bibliographies, so I don't know. I offer no authoritative advice on that, except just to mention it. Interestingly, the texts often have the author's quals, so students might need to create a role for themselves. They might need to make up who they are. I'm not sure if Fred Smith from 108 Boundary Street in South Townsville is really going to kind of establish that role and relationship that we want straight away. Sometimes it's in columns. We've got the personal pronouns, we've got that conversational tone, that intellectually chatty tone. Rhetorical questions in an essay. Oh my goodness. The language of judgment. We've got aesthetic features. So we might be asking students to use aesthetic features, but then where do we assess that? And I wonder if that comes up in the genre patterns and conventions, perhaps. I'm not sure. The structure, that teachers felt that it couldn't actually look like the publication for which they were writing. So if they were writing for the conversation, then they could format their document to look like that. And certainly in the ISMG, it talks about using written features and complementary features. Complementary features including digital features such as graphics, still and moving images, design elements. So there's that layer of complexity in this task as well. And certainly even in the grade 9 ACARA content descriptors, it's talking about encouraging students to publish in a variety of ways, experiment with publishing styles. So maybe this needs to come back, down into that kind of level. This one was interesting too. Varied paragraph lengths. What happens to Peel and Teal? Do we all start panicking? This was a big point of contention in Townsville. How do we teach students to write this type of text if we've been teaching Peel and Teal for 34 years? I don't know, I'm only 33. There's subheadings in these texts. How do you have a subheading in an essay? Oh my goodness. It was like just getting far too rebellious for us. And interesting tags. So tags are like hashtags and things at the beginning of these articles. So these are all design features that enhance the meaning of the text that they're creating. So, where do we start thinking about these these features of these texts? There's usually a hook, there's some background, it's review-like. And again, in the syllabus, it talks about elements of persuasive writing. Interestingly, this group had crossed out personal reflection. I don't know why. So I feel like there's a really good space for personal reflection in this task. There's childhood anecdotes. There's definitely a clear sense of the writer's identity in these texts. Referencing came up again. There's opinions, there's summaries, there's a visual progression of things. So images are interspersed throughout the text as you're scrolling. When you have one scroll, there's a new picture and a subheading, like it's almost as the way that you read these days. There's the language of judgment / appraisal, combination of first and third person. First person. Again, that intertextuality, which can be achieved through hyperlinks. Definitely a key understanding of the text being studied, but we didn't look into the analysis that was in these texts. We were looking just at the genre patterns and conventions. We had the essay here. The title reflects the interpretation, evaluative language, subheadings again, integration of quotes, normalisation. Relevance of the topic to students, need appropriate context. This was a really big sort of sticking point for us. We felt as though when we were designing our tasks, there needed to be an authentic reason for the students to be writing about these texts in this way. If they're writing for a public audience, then it needs to be a valid contention. Like, it needs to be something that's relevant to them, and it's something that's tricky. I'm not sure if I've already said this. I must have said it in my last seminar, but we in one of our grade 10 classes, we do Romeo and Juliet, the play and the film, the Baz Luhrmann film. And we sort of sat around asking ourselves, why are we still asking students to write about the Baz Luhrmann film? And then very next week in Screen Education, there was a brand new article on those Loyden films. So like, it's just kind of, it's hard to get that right, but it's something to really think about, I think, in your writing. We're thinking about using in grade 12 The Cellist of Sarajevo. It deals with issues of concepts of conflict, and we thought that might always kind of be timely in terms of the news. We thought maybe pairing it with a news article, perhaps even like really impressing ourselves and using a Four Corners doco and then nailing 2 texts off the prescribed text list. We're not too sure. But the blog, images used to engage throughout, byline, date, a blog banner. This could get dangerous for students. Titles, subtitles, fairly small paragraphs again. You can't read, it's not readable, reading a long paragraph on a screen. And I'm not suggesting that students should only be writing for a digital publication. Schools can definitely choose to be writing for a print publication. But the Stan Grant essay that I've given you has very long, dense paragraphs, something to think about. Most important info first as readers stop reading, link subject matter to external sources. Can be non-linear. The actual text that students are constructing. Are the readers of these texts supposed to click on the links as they read through it and then distract themselves with the new text and then come back? They're all kind of reading paths and hyper-reading techniques that sort of we need to think about. But interestingly, the language should be catered for an everyday audience. Essay for a public audience, broken into subheadings. So there wasn't anything groundbreakingly new for any particular text type of the 4 options that we're given. They're all quite similar. Clear introduction, middle and conclusion. They're not 5 paragraphs. So the word length is as 1,000 words to 1,500. They're going to be more than 5 paragraphs. So what does that do for our argument around the 5-paragraph essay, if that's an argument that we've had before? And I think that, these observations about real-life texts really resonate the sentiments of the president of VATE, who spoke at the crash course in text lists at the beginning of the year, where she said that we really need to be providing students with opportunities to be flexible in the way that they shape their response. We don't necessarily need a 5-paragraph essay that follows a Peel and Teal structure, and that can actually be quite limiting for students who might be pushing themselves and their own style of writing. So these observations about these text types sort of echoes those sentiments to me. Are there any questions about all of that information? A lot of it you probably already know. If you are interested in getting a copy of these photographs of the notes, then just send me an email and I can attach those to the PowerPoint. Yeah.
I was just interested in where the Marbo article was sitting, what sort of publication?
As in article or...
The Marbo article, what was it in?
I'm pretty sure it was Screen Education. It was either Screen Education or Metro. It was Screen Education. Issue 67. It's a nice little article, actually. It's a nice film. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It was really interesting to me to watch that as somebody new to Townsville, because a lot of this happened in Townsville. Anyway, that's an aside. Okay. Any other questions at all about the genre patterns and conventions? Because we might move on to the next section. Analysis of student work. So what I'm going to share with you now are my very candid reflections about a unit of work that we experimented with this year, and I offer this to you as an opportunity to learn from some mistakes that we've made, perhaps see something that you like or dislike and not do it, but it's part of our journey in where we're at in preparing our students for this text. It's not perfect, but it's interesting. And in a moment I'll hand out a student response to the task that we set students. So if you could, that's a current student's work. It's de-identified, but if you could leave it in the room, I'd appreciate that. If you want to take notes on the task design, or even if you took a photo of the task sheet, I'm more than happy for that. But if I could just keep the work confidential, I'd appreciate that. Okay, there's a little problem with my table here. I should have formatted it a little bit differently, but I'll talk to it anyway. This year, we've worked towards a vertical alignment of assessment techniques across each year level. By year 11 and 12, this will stop here at task 4, because obviously there's only 4 tasks across units 3 and 4 in grade 12, or whenever you do units 3 and 4. But we've got 5, and that's because, for 2 reasons. Firstly, we really valued the spoken imaginative response, and that's not captured in the English syllabus, although it is in the literature syllabus. So we didn't want our middle school students to miss out on those really enjoyable parts of English. And we also sort of ideologically wanted to encourage creativity in our program, and so this structure actually emphasises the creative aspects of student responses rather than analytical. And we know that creative writing always has those components of analysis in them, but from an assessment standpoint, we wanted it in our middle school to value creativity as well. And then in the literature syllabus, there's the spoken imaginative, so we've kept that in there to prepare students for that response. So we did that because we wanted to make life easier for ourselves, and it is easier. I'm not saying it's the only way to structure an English program, it's absolutely not. But gosh, it's easier when you're teaching the same genre across all of your classes at the same time. And what it's actually allowing us to do is then really carefully consider the specific expectations within each year level. What do we expect in an essay in grade 8 compared to the essay in grade 10? What are we specifically teaching at those year levels? So I'm finding that this structure is allowing those conversations to be had in a really sort of considered way in our faculty, but it's not the only way of structuring English, and I appreciate that as well. And just to kind of show you, even though we've designed our program with the end in mind, we've tried really hard to make sure our tasks are developmentally appropriate and aligned with ACARA. So I just thought I'd quickly flick to this sort of screen where you can see, these are the Year 8 achievement standards, which of the 5, which achievement standard is assessed in which instrument, and that goes through all the year levels for Year 8, 9 and 10. So it is aligned to ACARA, and we are using the achievement standards as our reporting advice, but we're designing it with that framework, with that structure of that senior English approach. I should also say that we will be offering English Essentials in our school, which has a different assessment sort of process, and next year we're including a separate Year 10 course that is more specifically aligned to the English Essentials program. So we're going to be having 3 kind of English courses in grade 10. But, there's this saying, hasten slowly, and I already feel like we're sort of revolutionary in our speed. So we can only do so much in such a short space of time.
Do you not include Year 7 in your high school?
Sort of, yes and no. We definitely have a middle schooling approach, but I haven't wanted to restrict the creativity that our Year 7 teachers have with their program. So they have lots of rich tasks and things like that, and so they're kind of moving this way, but I'm still trying to keep that sort of playful, organic approach in our Year 7 course. So good question. Yeah. Any other questions about that? No? Okay. So I'm going to share with you a unit from our Year 10 extension course that we reconfigured this year, and it's aimed at students who are academic. So they're probably going to be choosing literature when they select their subjects for the senior English. Probably half of them will choose English extension, and a small portion of them will choose the International Baccalaureate, which we also offer at our school. So this subject had to straddle several different destinations, if you will. And in the IB curriculum, one of the requirements is that students study a text that has been translated, so it was originally written in another language. So I've tried to introduce that in the Grade 10 Extension course to give students an understanding of the extra attention needed for context there. So we paired two texts, the All Quiet on the Western Front and the film Dunkirk. So the novel, not the film, All Quiet on the Western Front, and then Dunkirk the film, which just came out last year. And at the time, we had no idea about how good it was, the pairing, but that's one of the things that I can wholeheartedly suggest is that this pairing worked really, really well. I would like to think it was because I was intelligent, but it just kind of happened by accident. There are lots of things that accidentally happened that shouldn't have happened, but that was a good one. And what was good about it was that it had some really nice connecting concepts. So I think when you're choosing your text for this task, it's important to get those concepts really, really right. So we concentrated on the psychological trauma of war, or the representations of those concepts, I should say, the representations of bravery and courage, and the representations of the abuse of power. I'm not sure if you know the two texts, but for example, there's the narrator of the novel is really angry at his sense of betrayal from the teachers who encouraged him to enlist and just sat by in their classrooms and didn't actually engage in the war at all. He was really angry about that. Whereas in Dunkirk, there's some really nice scenes of those in authority who are there on the front line with the troops. So there's some contrasting ideas about those concepts as well, some contrasting perspectives, which is a nice way into the two texts. But what we didn't really realise at the time was that this pairing also allowed for some connecting stylistic features. And that's where this worked really well, was that the texts used similar techniques in the different modes, of course. So they both had a sort of a non-linear narrative structure. Dunkirk is told from three perspectives, from the land, the sea and the air, and each perspective is told within a different time frame. So the air story is very compressed but stretched out through the whole film, whereas the sea perspective is really sort of a medium length, and then the land takes, I'm not explaining this very well, but there's three stories over three different time frames that all intersect at various points. And All Quiet on the Western Front also has that kind of unclear sense of timing, and the narrative structure is not, it's hard to know how much time happens between chapters and things as it's kind of stretched out. There's lots of sensory scenes, lots of really sensory language in the novel, and then the film itself is actually, there's very little dialogue. It's the mise en scène, it's the soundtrack, it's really an overload of the senses. And I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I watched it at the cinema, and I was uncomfortable the whole time, like I just felt on edge. But I get really scared in movies too, so I think Jurassic Park kind of traumatised me as a child when it came out. There's a erratic perspective. But what was also really nice about the two texts was that it used symbolism in a really similar way. So they both used these symbols of the dead boots and the shivering soldiers and the earth, and so there were lots of really nice connections that made pairing the texts really easy. And then what made it even better was the fact that while they do all of these things similarly, they achieve different effects. So the novel is very condemnatory of war. It was very, the narrator is just scathing in the way that he represents his elders and the actual war scenes, whereas Dunkirk, we felt as a class, was more observational. It was more there to kind of chronicle what actually happened rather than cast judgment over a particular scenario. And so by going into tone for our sort of, really kind of deep analysis there, it allowed students to really carefully and maturely analyse the attitudes, values and beliefs that are in the text. Tone seemed to be a really good way to do that. And so that was nice. Are there any yes?
Can I just ask you, when you taught it, because I taught All Quiet on the Western Front 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Did you talk about the fact that that was written just after the war and he was,
Yes.
it was very raw, whereas
Yes.
Dunkirk is looking back?
We certainly did. And interestingly, we also read the introduction to the novel, the non-fiction novel Dunkirk, that was written by Chris Nolan, who was the director of the film. And in his introduction to the non-fiction novel, Chris Nolan talks about how he wanted his film to carry on from those earlier texts like All Quiet on the Western Front and continue that dialogue, which we didn't know when we chose the text either. And then we found this introduction and we're like, we are just on fire. Doesn't happen very often when things work out that well, but that did. Yes, so context was really important in looking at especially the novel. And what was nice also was that when we studied Dunkirk, the film The Darkest Hour was in the cinemas, which is of course there's the story leading up to the Winston Churchill's famous speech, "We shall fight on the beaches, and then we are going to go in and save these men on the beaches of Dunkirk." And so we were able to go to the cinema and watch that as well. And kids really got a sense of the fact that a text belongs to a suite. It's not just a separate identity just floating around in the world. It actually contributes to an ongoing kind of shifting conversation about the world. Any other questions? Okay.
Link in that idea of like the just war versus like World War almost not done.
Yeah, there's lots of discussions about that, and because the kids, because they're really motivated, they're quite empathetic little souls too. Some of them, there's scenes in the novel that are really harrowing. When one of the characters has to sort of take cover in a coffin with skeletons in it. They're in a graveyard and the coffin gets blown up and it's just it gives you the heebie-jeebies. So they really kind of connected with it in a way that I don't think they anticipated. And so I'm going to share some slides with you about how we tried to teach this unit. And this slide is a sample of a student's book. Now I know that not everybody can ask students to buy their texts, but this year I made the decision that we're not going to have books, dirty old germy books, sitting as fire hazards in a dark corner of the library anymore. Students are going to buy their texts, and for this reason, because I want them interrogating their text. So we give the students a bookmark, and on that bookmark it's got colour coding for their highlighters. It's on their stationery list. They have a very specific pack of highlighters, and each colour means a different thing, and then as they're reading they need to highlight things. I don't care if they get it wrong. I just want them to consider their text deeply as they're reading it. So we always ask students to use yellow first, and yellow just means as they're reading the first time, they highlight the passages that affect them in some way, whether they're angry or frightened or sad or whatever. And they might make notes about how they feel on the page as they're writing. If that's all they do on their first reading, I'm happy. And here you're probably saying, I hope they can get it. If I can get my kids to read it a second time, that'd be good. So I get that that's not a reality for everyone. But on their second reading, then I want them to look at the text a little bit more deeply. So in this course this year, we moved away from actually doing sort of comprehension exercises. And I would just go around the room and pick up their book and have a flick through. And if they'd highlighted stuff, then I knew they'd read it. Whether or not they matched up with what I wanted them to highlight, well, that's fine. More power to them. I did also give them, once they had highlighted their book the first time with yellow, I gave them some secondary readings about the style of the text, which they could then use to inform their other colours. So we've got blue is a structural device, purple is tone, pink is symbolism and metaphor, and those sorts of things. So that's working well. So this is an 10 extension class. With our other Year 10 classes this term, they're studying The Dry by Jane Harper. I'm not sure if you've read that text. It's Australian crime fiction. Kids are loving it. They're loving it so much that they keep forgetting to get out their yellow highlighters. But that's a good text if you're thinking about something too. And so what we, yes?
Sorry, which grades do you do the highlighting?
We're starting that as early as possible. In grade 8 and 9, we do the giver and the outsiders. I've already got book room, I've already got all those texts in my library, so I'm not mandating that students buy those texts. I am encouraging parents, though, to try and buy the texts and get them started on this habit. But from grade 10 onwards, they're buying their texts and they're highlighting. Yeah. In Mount Isa, I could never have done that, and I recognise that. Alrighty, so as I said to you earlier, this unit was straddling the IB agenda as well, and one of the assessment techniques in the International Baccalaureate is that students are given an appointment time slot, and they come into the classroom and there's 20 envelopes on the table, and they choose an envelope, and in the envelope are some passages from the novel or whatever text they've been studying. They've got about 5 or 10 minutes to look through those passages, and then they've got to give a 20-minute presentation about them. So it's a pretty tricky assessment technique, and it requires them to have really engaged deeply with the text that they've studied in advance. So part of me wanted to kind of introduce students to that sort of assessment environment and see how they went. So what we started doing was every Monday I'd give them a selection of passages from the novel, and I'd give them 20 minutes to highlight whatever they wanted to with the passage. So they knew what their highlighters meant, and they would take some notes. So I know you can't read the actual notes there, but you know the student there is writing words about the tone at that particular time, or the techniques there. They've made links with other passages from the novel. They could have their novel with them, and I just give them 20 minutes to kind of get to know that specific passage. I would prompt them, and I'd give them advance notice to say, okay, next Monday, you'll get passages from this chapter, so they knew that they had to know that chapter in advance. And that's how I kind of tested comprehension, but I was really more after assessing their, or formatively assessing their analysis skills. So they had 20 minutes to settle their nerves and get used to the passage, and then I would give them, and there were about 4 passages across the class, so 4 different options. And then I'd give them one question that could be applied to any of the passages. And I'd write the question on the board, and they would have to write me an analytical paragraph about that in response to that particular question. And while they had 20 minutes to do that, maybe 30 minutes, depending on how I kind of sensed they were going with it. And while they were doing that, I also wrote my own paragraph in response to that question. I had the advantage of knowing it, but I didn't write anything beforehand because I wanted them to see me struggle a bit too. And certainly I've been doing that activity with the importance of being earnest this term, and it's way harder. Sometimes I'm sitting in the room going, this is really hard. Are you finding this really hard? And they're all like, oh, thank God. They're kind of really, it's struggling. It's hard to write analytically about satire. But that's something that we're learning about. And then they might discuss their paragraphs with someone else. They'll have a look at someone else's, and they might try and find someone else who had the same passage and have a look at their paragraphs. And I'll project my paragraph onto the board, and then we'll sort of compare them. And I'll talk through what I would have changed, what I liked about it, what I found hard. I'd pull out features that I wanted them to notice. You do all that, I'm sure, in your own teaching. So here's a couple of examples of what I know you can't. Oh, I haven't even got the right. Sorry, I should have made sure that you could see the bigger version of it. Is that better? Sorry about that. You can see what they've chosen to write about. There's another one. And so this isn't a separate book that I keep in the classroom, so they can actually see the progress of their writing. So it's almost like a journal, and I want them to keep that book going so that it'll carry across year levels ideally. and it's only used for this activity. So this was kind of like a pilot in our school for this sort of foundational sort of learning, and we're thinking of sort of making it more across the board, especially from grade 10 onwards, but maybe even in grade 9 at various points. And another one. So you can see that each student has kind of approached the passage slightly differently, and that's fine. I'm not too worried about that. I'm just happy that they've engaged with it and tried to write a considered paragraph.
What was green? Sorry.
Green was writing definitions, so that's always the words that they want to define with a dictionary or something like that. Or it might have like a really sort of, especially in poetry, it might have a double meaning that we hadn't considered. So that's a nice little activity, and it really gets them ready for exams. But I didn't want to mark them all, because that's a lot of marking all the time. And so what we did over a series of weeks was we developed this self-assessment tool. So we looked at the paragraphs that I would write on the board and their own paragraphs and each other's, and we would work out what we liked about them, what the good things that they were that they did. Originally in this column here, the red one, I had the descriptor needs revising, and I decided to not be polite anymore and just tell them it was inadequate, because some people don't get that subtlety. My extension kids do, but others tend not to. And so we found some things that worked really in paragraph writing. So we found that if the last sentence of the paragraph used the word audience, and that really synthesised the argument, and it made sure that the students weren't treating the characters as real people, but they were instead looking at characterisation. And then, analytical verbs is just the big one. And look, I'm not saying that to get an A you need to have 4 analytical verbs in every paragraph, but kids like numbers, so we just sort of said, here's a good number. But if they had more or slightly less and it still did the right thing, in their actual assessment, then I was quite happy with that. And so if you're wondering what I mean by analytical verbs, well, I'd give them a list, and it would say things like embellish, accentuates, illustrates, highlights, foregrounds, those verbs that actually indicate the effect of the technique in their writing. So we've really worked hard on using those verbs, using present tense, punctuating, tried to emphasise the contrasting conjunction when they're comparing. So that's fairly straightforward, I think, but this actually really helped my workload and my mental health. And it also, the kids could see their progress, so they would put those into their journals, and they could see, where they were highlighting things as they went along. And what I would try and do over the term is make sure I filled one out for every student in the class at some point. So I didn't read through every paragraph every time, but I'd just try and pick 2 or 3 each week to have a scan over and quickly give them some feedback that way. Okay, any questions about that? I could have given this to them. I could have used my own brain, but I'm tired of using my own brain all the time, and I want my kids to use their brains too. And so by doing it, took longer. It took a few weeks to get to this point where we were kind of happy with it. But I feel like it was definitely worth the trouble of getting them to come up with this. And we had brainstormed on the board, and I'd take it away and just tighten up the expression a bit or think about it a bit more. But generally, it was their work.
Grace, also when kids create this themselves, it's far more powerful for them than it is when we just give it to them.
I know.
They write it in their own words and things like that.
And
they know what they mean, what they're looking for. And I often do this and share it with get the kids to help each other create the criteria.
It's time consuming though. So if you're really sort of pressed to get in lots of assessment, I don't know how you'd fit this in, but by going to only 5 assessment tasks in the year, we had a whole term to be able to really flesh this out, and by selecting 2 texts that weren't both novels or plays. So because we chose a novel and a film, that made it easier. Like I know some schools, and more power to you if you can manage it, are doing 2 novels for this task, the IA1. You know, it's not a battle that I'd be comfortable choosing. I wouldn't have even done it with my extension kids, so I think a pretty extension. And you'll be able to make your own judgment about that very soon. I'm going to give you a real task, which is a nerve-wracking experience. So, some things about it first. This was our first attempt at a generic assessment template that we'd like to use from year at least 8, potentially 7, not too sure about that, to year 11. And I know the QCAA has just released some information about how the assessment techniques are going to look in the new system. So this was our first go. We've used ISMGs in year 10, and I've been orbiting, that's a new word. Have you heard the term orbiting? Apparently it comes from like online dating, where you just... It's not something that I've done, that's what is out there, but it's when you follow somebody online but don't actually engage, you just kind of orbit. So I've been orbiting this Facebook discussion on the ETAC website about the place of ISMGs in other places than grade 12 and not contributing to the dialogue at all. So I have used an ISMG in grade 10. I recognise the mixed feelings that there might be about that. I'm very grateful that nobody has died as a result of using an ISMG in grade 10. Remarkably, perhaps even radically, nobody has even fallen ill. So that is good news. And the reason why we're doing it is because we're trying to upskill ourselves, but I recognise that it's not for everyone.
Can I ask, do you convert those to grades then?
Okay. All right, so this has caused us a lot of stress. Before, in theory, when we were trying to decide what was an A, we said that, okay, to get an A, they've got to have the majority of descriptors in that top row. And then we marked some, and we felt like some of the responses that didn't have the majority in that top row, we would have still given A minuses to. So then we moved away from that rigidity and said, okay, we think a score of 19 in year 10, a score of 19 is the start of the A range. So we didn't tell students that from 19 to 21 it's an A minus, and then from 22 to 23 it's an A, and then 24 or 25 is an A plus. We didn't divvy it up that way because it's not even. You've got 25 marks to try and get into, it was horrible. So I just sort of said, well, here's the minimum to get an A, and you've got an A, so get on with your life. That's kind of how we sort of approached it. We're not sure what that's going to look like in our school just yet. Our administration hasn't given us sort of holistic guidance about that. I prefer not to give an A level of achievement at all and just rely on the ACARA standards descriptors and the reporting advice in the syllabus to be able to give it an overall level of achievement at the end of the year. But that's just the world according to Loyden, so I don't know. But I'll talk a bit more about that when I hand them out. Good question. We also, interestingly, realised that like a 50% score, like 12.5 out of 50, that's 25, sorry, lucky I'm not a maths teacher, was better than a C minus. Because in the descriptors, it talks about superficial analysis. And I think if you look at a C minus response now, there's still a level of superficiality in their writing and their analysis, and so I felt like by giving that a D, it wasn't quite right either. And so we looked to the IB, and we looked to some of the expertise that we already had in our faculty. We had teachers who have taught overseas in other external exam situations, and in their systems it's a 40% is the minimum for a C minus. So we kind of, yeah. So we just didn't go 12 to get a C minus. We went a bit lower than that. People might have already written notes on these. Feel free to write on whatever you want to write or make comments. I just need them back again. to check the air conditioning because I feel like it's just turned off. Okay, I don't know if that's done anything. But anyway, okay. So, okay, the first thing that I do not like about this text, this assessment instrument, and would not advocate that any of you do, is turn this into an exam. So we actually were forced to make this task an exam in our school. For some reason, my administration team thinks that the world doesn't revolve around English and have calendarised a whole school exam in English in term 1. And I'm not about to make my teachers mark a detached exam that's got nothing to do with anything. I'm not turning it into NAPLAN practice or whatever just for the sake of it. So we made this be an exam, but I'm just going to rely on my diva characteristics and keep fighting it. But at the moment it's an exam. It's too hard for an exam, and in the syllabus, in the senior syllabus, it's a 5-week task. So they were allowed to bring in a copy of the novel. I'm not letting them do that for the exam that they're doing this term, because this term is replicating the conditions of what they'll do in senior. But because this equivalent task of the IA1 is a scene question, they can have access to the assignment in the development of their response. So I let them have their access to the text in the exam. Okay, so they had 2 hours. You can see on the second page that was the prompt that students needed to write to. And I've got very little time now to kind of get through this. Basically, in advance, the students saw everything except that assessment task box. So I gave them the task sheet with that blank box, and so they knew all the conditions, they knew all the conventions of the task, then they knew how they were going to be marked. You'll see that in the actual ISMG I've used a highlighter. We don't do that now. So we started with highlighters as a bad idea. Instead we use a pencil and we draw a circle around the individual dots. That works better for us, and then once we've done the dots we can determine which number best matches those dots. You can't choose the number before choosing the dots. You've got to choose the dots first. It doesn't sound very intellectual, but that's how it goes. Choose the dots first and then the number. You have to be able to justify whether it's an 8 or whatever. Now, when I first marked this response, I gave it a score of 24. When it was cross-marked, and you'll see on the front, the student got a score of 23. I included this sample for you today deliberately because there was disagreement about it. And we have realised after this that a 1-point difference in our faculty is agreement. So, and in whatever case, we give the student the highest score. So if I had originally marked it at a 24 and the cross marker felt like it was more of a 25, then we go to 25. If I marked it as a 24 and the cross marker thought it was 23, well then we go to 24. So the student always gets the better score in those discussions. So that's something that we found that hard, yes.
What if there was more than 1 point?
Then that's when there needs to be a discussion between the 2 teachers. Yeah. And if they can't agree, obviously every school's got their own approaches to that sort of situation. I'll give you a really quick scan of the essay. I don't want to take too much time. I know that it's nearly lunch. You'll see that we approached the teaching of this task by asking the students to treat each text separately. So they had some kind of introduction, then they analysed text 1, then they analysed text 2, and then they had 1 or 2 paragraphs where they were looking at the connection between the 2 texts. It could be done differently, but we felt like the first time students were approaching a literary comparison, that was kind of a straightforward way to go about it. And you'll see towards the end, if you look at the back paragraph, page 5, I think this paragraph is kind of getting to where we want to be in terms of the analysis. While similar, both texts have a significantly different tone towards the trauma. Dunkirk creates an observational perspective of the soldier's loss of mentality. The blame for characters' torment, such as the children, has never ended. The detached perspective does not allow empathy. And then it goes into what happens with All Quiet. On the other hand, All Quiet often accuses the actions of others. And there's some grammar things there that aren't great, but at a grade 10 level, I think it's pretty sweet, pretty nice. Especially under exam conditions, to an unseen question. So yeah, that tone paragraph kind of was really nice. And we tried to get them to think about the ongoing significance of the discussion in the first place. So in their conclusion, rather than just summarise what they've already talked about, we wanted them to sort of let the importance of the topic itself endure. And so, like, you know, this concluding statement, literature about war, it should be, provides an insight into traumatic experiences that the history books cannot. So it's kind of like sort of thinking about why it's important to look at war in literature and things like that. So we're kind of getting there. What this essay doesn't do, though, is it doesn't have that stylised approach that I showed you in those photographs that we looked at from the teachers. So it is an essay written for an academic publication, Metro Magazine. And what we knew that when we were teaching this unit, that we were missing out on that aspect of the genre. And that's where we're going to take it next year in year 11. So we feel like in grade 10, this is a nice place to start a really healthy, robust and deep analysis of a text. And then in grade 11, going to the style. I'd like to pull that a little bit earlier, but I still need to do some more scaffolding in my middle years to get that ready for that. And what we're doing now is I gave these back to students and I asked them to type up their responses, and now we're starting to be more playful with their language and their paragraphing and adding in those stylistic features in a formative way. So they're not being assessed on that, but I explained to them that that was the next step for this task, the equivalent of this task, and so we're looking at that in a non-threatening way. Are there any questions? Yes?
What sort of, I'm not sure if you did answer this, what sort of conclusions did you come to about the peel or the teal? Okay, so
for the essay, then we felt more comfortable applying that sort of archetype, if you will. But with these kids in this class, they need to be extended beyond that. So that's why I'm trying to bring that forward in the more playful approach to this text now. Yes, yeah. So that's what we're doing now when we have time. So like if we finish our assessment in week 9, then when we've got those extra days, then we pull out this file on the computer and start messing around with it a bit more. So I'm trying to do that more organically. I wish we could have captured it then, but yeah, we still need to get there.
11s and 12s then?
Yes, it'll be much. So we're assuming that they know this now. Like they need to know that you can't just bury knowledge that you've built up in the past and not resurrect it. You know, we're building on it each year, and so by them seeing that vertical alignment, they know that it gets harder each year, and they've got a profile now that actually goes from year 8 to year 12. So I found these plastic profiles with tabs, and so there's one tab for each assessment technique. So, you know, our year 8s and 9s will now have 3 goes at that type of text before they get to year 11, and they'll be able to pull them out and see how it's been stepped up each time. Any other questions? Okay, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for your time today.